Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law. Today we shall discuss First Family by Professor Joseph Ellis. Professor Ellis, who previously has written books on George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and the events of the Revolutionary era and the early years of the Republic, is one of America's leading historians and writers on that period. His prior work has won both a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award. The book we shall discuss today, First Family, which has just come out in paperback, the hardcover edition was published in 2010, is the story of the marital and political partnership of John and Abigail Adams. It has won the Best Nonfiction by a Massachusetts Writer Award. In the fascinating pages of First Family, you will learn a trove about a marriage, views, and actions that were instrumental in creating our country, and about the historical and political events of the founding period. Professor Ellis, the author, was the very first author ever interviewed on Books of Our Time, fully a decade ago, and is a trustee of the Massachusetts School of Law and the American College of History and Legal Studies. He is with me today to discuss his latest work, First Family. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Joe, thank you for being with us for the third or fourth time, I guess.
It's always great to be back, Larry. Thank you.
On his TV shows, which gave me the idea for this program, Brian Lamb is always asking, I would say he is forever asking, very gruffly, what do you write? You know, what time of day? Where do you do it?
Yeah.
Do you use a computer?
I was on a program. He asked me that then.
Yeah.
And,
so why don't you, I have never seen before something that you did in the acknowledgement section in the rear of your book, where you describe your methods. So that was so interesting to me, and so wonderfully and delightfully old-fashioned. Why don't you tell the audience where you do your writing, when, so on, how, so on and so forth?
I do my writing, most of it in the morning, usually rewriting in the evening in my study, surrounded by, this book started a golden retriever and a Jack Russell, and now it's a Labradoodle and a Jack Russell, and a very brave cat. There is no technology in the room, apart from the lights. I write longhand with a roller ball, fine point, black ink, on the back of Xerox paper.
Previously used.
Previously, the front side is used, and you just keep it and printouts from various things. You can just have a huge stash of that stuff. Eventually, what I write is rewritten and then put on a disc, and you can play with it there.
Who rewrites it?
Well, I rewrite it, and then I give it to my assistant, whose name is Linda Fernandez, and Linda types it into onto the internet. And but the basic creativity for Ellis, if there is such a thing, occurs in the rhythm between my brain motions and the movement of my hand and my wrist. There is some connection there, I believe, and you sometimes if you're really fast typer, you can type too fast. You can type faster than you can think, and that's not good. It produces these pauses. Anyway, I'm obviously very old-fashioned, although some people who accuse me of writing with a quill pen, I don't do that. It works for me. Maybe someday I'll become technologically literate, but I'm trying to keep that as far into the future as possible.
Given the results to date, I would push it far back. People have tried to persuade you to change.
Oh, yeah.
And you have told them no. And I think it's fair to say that for every book they produce, you produce 3, 4, 5. But why do they want you to, what is their alleged reason for wanting you to change, besides technological conformity, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. And it's like, it's a way of trying to make me do something that I don't want to do out of some petulant academic reason I don't understand. But maybe it's well-intentioned in many instances. Look, Joe, this will make it so much easier for you. And it's because I'm weird. It's singular in this regard. And and they would like everybody to be alike.
You know, people have this thought that what's newer is always better. I think not.
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to sound like I'm coming out against technology or the automobile or anything like that.
Yeah.
You asked me how I would work, and that's how it is. It's very old-fashioned, but so far it's been successful.
And another thing that I think is hugely important, you read all the stuff yourself.
Yeah, I don't have any research assistants. I have an assistant who takes care of the translating this into print, and sometimes I have students who help me get books.
Yeah.
But I've never been able to manage research assistants, primarily because if I already know what to tell them to look for, then I don't need them. And and I also think my eyes have to see it, because what I will see is not the same thing that somebody else will see, in the way of an anecdote, a particular quotation, something that would fly by most research assistants. So it takes a little bit longer in the research phase for me, though the research phase is not totally separate from the writing phase. I found that I have to start writing before I'm really ready in times, because then I'll know where I'm going to head in the next piece of research.
Right.
So that it's a back and forth kind of thing. Though you have to get a certain foundation of research done so that you pretty much know what the story is before you can really start writing.
Sometime in the 1930s, Joe, when you and I were not around,
No.
Louis Brandeis, or maybe it's the 20s, said that the reason the Supreme Court was still the most respected body in Washington is that it's the last place in Washington where people do their own work. And that is no longer as true as it used to be.
Right.
But what Brandeis said and what you have just described are exactly the same. There is no substitute for the creative mind looking at something himself or herself. There is no substitute.
And when people have gotten into trouble for plagiarism, famous writers, it's usually because of research assistants. They didn't realize what the research assistant was giving them in the way of direct quotation that wasn't directly quoted, and therefore they reproduce it in their book, but they're responsible.
Yeah. And conversely, the research assistant does not know, as you know, what to look for. And is not struck by things which you have to have a tremendous background of knowledge to be struck by.
Yeah, I've been at this for 42 years.
Yeah.
And so, if somebody 23 years old is supposedly looking at this stuff, it's not going to be the same.
Yeah. They say that young people do the best work in math and science, but that's not when it comes to the humanities. One other thing, Joe, that's not directly relevant to what we've been talking about, but you mentioned at lunch that so many of your students do not understand your notations on the papers that they hand into you because they do not know how to write or read cursive.
Yeah, it's a recent phenomenon that, you know how when you're correcting student papers or commenting on it, on the margins, and then a longer message at the end, you're writing this longhand. And in recent years, I've had more and more students come up to me and say, Professor Ellis, I can't read this. I can't read your writing. I said, it's perfectly good writing. What's wrong? He said, then I said, why can't you read? He says, oh, I can't read cursive. And so, I ask the students, do any of you send letters that are handwritten? If I get a handwritten letter, I feel honored. They feel dishonored. They feel that a more familiar kind of correspondence is in print form or digital form. And for me, if somebody's taken the time to handwrite a letter, that's just great.
You know, it occurred to me when you said this, Joe, that the profession of historian is in a certain sense eating its young by not demanding that people who get degrees in history learn cursive, because how are those people going to read the archives?
Well, it's almost like they have to learn another language.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It'll have to be taught as a foreign language.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, this is astounding to me, but so be it. We find this in the law school too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now let's talk about the book itself as opposed to the methods that you use. This book, First Family, is the story of a partnership as seen extensively through the letters written one partner to the other. If you would elaborate on that a little bit, explain the different function of letters in those days and today, which I suppose to many people will be self-evident, and what the problem was that created distance in those days as opposed to now when you pick up your cell phone and you say, hello, Afghanistan. You know?
Right, right. That's a multi-part question.
Yes, it is.
Let me do justice to it if I can. This is a book about two people who meet, eventually fall in love, and stay together for 59 years. During that time, they happen to be living their lives across the most consequential landscape in American history, namely the coming and winning of the War for Independence, and then the creation and securing of the first enduring American republic. And it's the longest standing republic in world history. Part of it is about the meaning of love and how it changes over time between a man and a woman. A political collaboration between Abigail and John that is most noticeable once he becomes president. But a partnership also in terms of raising the children. They really are a partnership marriage. And they are the most fully revealed couple in this era and maybe in American history because of their letters. There's about 1,200 of them that have survived. And it's not just the quantity of the letters, it's the quality of the letters. They talk to each other about very important and intimate stuff. In fact, at one point, Abigail says, I can write to you some things that I cannot say to you. And that, again, to your question, letter writing in the 18th century was an art. And the founders contain among them Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, less so Washington, master letter writers. And Abigail, though not formally schooled, she was what we would call homeschooled by her father and her grandmother, was an extremely literate person and very well read in the British classics. Her favorite author was Shakespeare. So you've got a couple that are intellectual equals writing to each other in an extremely intimate way about all kinds of personal things at the moment that America is being created.
Right.
So this is what enriches the correspondence. And we'll never know as much about Barack and Michelle Obama because of the internet and the cell phone. Distance, well, first of all, letter writing then was not like writing an email is for most younger people today. It was a more deliberative process. And for example, when John is down in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress and she's up in Braintree, which will soon become Quincy, takes about 2 weeks for a letter to go from one to the other. When the letter came to her, it was read aloud at the dinner table to all the kids. And then she took it into her little closet and she reread again. And that's when she tended to write her own responses. She wrote in the evening. John tended to write at 4:30 to 5:30 in the morning.
Right.
Because he was on all these committees and all these other things and didn't have other time. Her letters are longer, more literate, more, that's not the right word. John's very literate too, but more, make more references to literary works, literary allusions. And there are sometimes you come across a phrase and you say, she wrote to Jefferson once, faithful are the wounds of a friend. And I thought, boy, that's a great phrase. Well, it's in Proverbs, okay? And she's getting it from someplace else.
Yeah.
But the psychological difference then, too, produced by distance, and the fact that instant communications and interactive communications were impossible, especially when he's in Europe and she's back in Quincy. So it's 6 months before a message can get from one end to the other. It really does mean that when you sit down to write a letter, it assumes much more dramatic significance.
Right.
You are creating a set of pictures for the receiver and a persona.
Right.
This is an expression of a whole persona. It's not just a jotted stream of consciousness thing. And distance also meant that you didn't know what was happening to your partner. There's a moment in the summer of 1777 in June. Abigail's pregnant with what will turn out to be the last pregnancy. And he knows she's pregnant, but he doesn't know how far along she is and whether she's delivered. And he's worried about what General Howe is going to do and the he said, "I'm concerned about the movements of the British Army. You being concerned about the movements inside your own body." Well, it turns out that something happens to the kid. She feels it. She says, "I think something's wrong," and then she starts to have contractions, and she writes to him in between contractions. Okay, and eventually, the kid is born, and it's stillborn. It's dead. Perfect, but dead. And she writes to him. Well, see, that takes 2 weeks for that letter to get there. And during that time, he's writing to her all about the politics of what's going on in the Continental Congress. And then when the letter gets to him, he says, "Oh, my God, I feel so guilty that I wasn't there and that I've been bothering her with all this other irrelevant stuff." Later on, when he is president and she is sick with rheumatism and other complications, he decides to stay with her and not go down to Philadelphia for like a year. And everybody's really critical of him. He said, I left her once when she was in trouble, and I'm not going to ever leave her again. So that's one of the reasons.
He was at the time president.
Yes.
Yeah.
He said, we can do everything by mail.
Yeah. As I remember, you make the point that the people in Philadelphia thought, well, he's up in Braintree worrying about the British and the French and this and that, and he actually was worrying about his crops and his wife.
Yeah, yeah.
I was very surprised to read, Joe, that although we have 1,200 of the letters, or something on that order, a lot of times letters, as soon as the British Navy appeared over the horizon, they'd all go into the drink.
Right. During the war, Abigail said, I'm probably sending most of these letters to Neptune. Yeah. And because they were carried on board ship, obviously they didn't have any other airplanes to fly it over. And as you say, if a British warship appeared on the horizon, they threw all the mail overboard, even though that seems sort of crazy, but they believed that the intelligence that would have been made available to the British justified it. It's one of the ironic things is they kept not consistently, Abigail and John periodically copied their letters so that when she would write a letter and send it to him when he was in Paris, she had a copy. That means we have the letter at the Mass Historical Society, okay? But in many instances, it never got to John.
Right.
So we got to read it before he did. And so that's weird, and you're not quite sure which ones are which in this regard.
Right. You say that he was nuts about eternal fame.
Yeah.
And
from the beginning, from the beginning of his diary as a young kid.
Yeah.
He is practicing in front of a mirror the mannerisms of Cicero.
Really?
The body posture.
Really?
He has no respect for somebody whose highest aspiration is to make money or to get wealthy.
Right.
There's a higher form of significance, which is to serve the public and to be remembered.
Right.
That's the key, to be remembered as the public figure whose behavior significantly affected policy. In this case, the winning of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
But And so when the imperial crisis begins really in 1764-65 with British legislation, chiefly the Stamp Act, Adams is looking for it, okay? He is looking for a cause to lash himself to, larger than himself. His father had wanted him to be a minister, and he went to Harvard, and at that time, most people became ministers, though they were starting now to become lawyers. A dangerous trend, I should say. And,
it has gone beyond all bounds.
And he had his calling to public service was like the calling of a minister to a cause that is also otherworldly. And but he harbored this obsession about the letters and about fame, in part because he really wasn't sure there was a spiritual life after death in the traditional Christian sense of the term. He and Jefferson and a few other people exchanged letters on this, and Adams's ultimate position is agnostic. Well, I don't know, but if there isn't one, I'll never know it. Right. He has a funny line that I think I have in the book. He says, if it can ever be shown that conclusively that there is no life after death, my advice to every man, woman, and child on the planet is to take opium, which is a great line. But it's only a person who does significant public service is worthy of being in the history books.
Right.
And the history books keep alive your memory, as well as the letters that you will also leave. So he wants us to remember him. Right. And in some ways, the fact that we're sitting here in Massachusetts on this day in 2011 confirms his fondest hope, namely that he will live on.
You say at one point that we are the audience for whom he was striving.
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah.
Like we're in some sense complicitous in his greatness because he's performing for us. He's on his best behavior because he knows we're looking.
But you also said it took 200 years. Why did it take 200 years?
Because, and there still isn't an Adams monument in the middle of the mall or anything like there is for Jefferson and Washington, which would surprise that generation. They would be surprised, I mean, not that Washington was there, but that Jefferson was there and Adams wasn't. They would have reversed that. When Adams, with the first public election after the Constitution was essentially a referendum on the founders. Who was the greatest? Washington was first, Adams was second. Partly, Adams is tough to make into an icon because he tells you too much about himself. One of the reasons the Supreme Court stays above it all, and one of the reasons that Washington stays above it all, is because we don't really know what they're talking about. You know, the meetings are secret. Right. And until recently, you didn't allow a camera in there, right?
I don't know whether you still can get a camera
There's
in
somebody
there.
petitioning for that for the case of the
C-SPAN is.
Yeah, the healthcare case.
Yes.
Adams is imperfect. He's vain. He's ambitious. He has a temper. He's also extremely lovable, extremely honest. He's a human being of considerable interesting parts. But to the extent that we want our founders perfect, he's never going to make it on Mount Rushmore.
Right.
Now, of course, none of them is perfect.
Right.
And I think the resurgence of interest in Adams is a sign that we are finally matured and recognized that we can't be expecting perfection from our historical heroes. And just because they're capitalized and mythologized as founding fathers, we've got to see them as imperfect creatures. Great in many instances, but imperfect. Well, Adams is the breakthrough guy. He is the greatest and the most imperfect of them all.
Right.
And I think in the HBO series that was put together a few years ago, a miniseries, the depiction of him is very, very accurate. I mean, the characterization of him by Giamatti, the actor, is well done. Yeah. And he's a hero for our time, at last.
You say that the Adamses are the most important couple in American history. Are they more important, and in what ways are they like or different from the Roosevelts?
I think that what I was trying to say is they're the most prominent couple in American history that have told us so much about their relationship and allowed us to recover so much of that. The relationship between Franklin and Eleanor is a different kettle of fish, and I think he gave her a lot of independence. You know, when the Civil Rights Act and the UN, those were her own bailiwicks. But of course, we now know he was having affairs with his secretary, and she was having probably an affair with a woman, a friend of hers. Though we don't know the whole story there. I'd be interested if anybody can come up with a real couple that can match Abigail and John in terms of the volume of letters and what we know about the inner lives of these people and the significance of what they achieved. Okay?
Why did she save the letters? I mean, he was a nut on an eternal fame. Why did she save the letters?
Because he told her to.
He told her to.
And she would say, I saved them for our family, for my grandchildren. She wouldn't say, I saved it for posterity. She would say, these are documents for the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren.
Right, right. A form of posterity.
Yes.
They succeeded in siring 3 further generations of what you could call great people.
Yeah, it's like American, it's probably the greatest family in American history. Right. I mean, the Jameses are pretty powerful, and I guess there are people that want to argue the Bushes can claim this, but the Bushes, well, there is the first father-son president, John and John Quincy, and then George and George W. But she was the conscious founder of a dynasty. Right. Now, they invested so much in John Quincy. From the time he was out of the womb, they were expecting him to become the first magistrate of the Republic. They didn't have the presidency yet, so they couldn't think that way. Like every kid in America, now women as well as girls as well as boys are told they could be president. John Quincy was told, if you don't, you're a failure, complete. And probably the best educated, best read person ever to enter the presidency, which he was a total failure at. And but you're right. But in each generation of the Adamses, first in the Abigail and John's kids, and then their kids, their grandkids, there's one person who excels, and often quite impressively, and then the rest of them end up failures. Some cases, alcoholics, drug addicts. They have miserable lives. They married the wrong person. Abigail and John's case, Nabby, the oldest and only daughter, ends up marrying this guy who was a former officer in the Continental Army on Washington's staff, graduate of Princeton, dashingly handsome. Perfect choice, right? It only shows you never know. Because this guy ends up being a bum and couldn't hold down a job and loses all his money. Charles is the charmer. And it's difficult when you're reading the letters and you encountering the young kids and what people are saying about them. Charles, everybody loves Charlie. Like Charlie's, even dogs just follow him wherever he goes. And you know what's going to happen to Charlie. Charlie is going to die at 30 years of age as an alcoholic and a drug addict and living in whorehouses in New York City, despite the fact that he has a wife and 2 kids.
Right.
The other kid, Tommy, who's almost invisible in the correspondence, Thomas, the youngest, he looks good. He goes to Harvard. He works for John Quincy as an assistant in Prussia. But, it never works out for him. And he becomes an alcoholic. And he moves back to live near his parents. And he meets a local girl, and they have 11 kids. That's the only thing he seems to be able to do. And but he's a failure.
But after that generation, there was the generation of Charles Francis Adams.
Right. Becomes American ambassador to England during the Civil War.
Right.
And he keeps he keeps England off the side of the South,
Right.
which is a huge achievement.
Right.
And his son writes about that
Right.
in the education of Henry Adams.
Henry Adams.
That's the third generation.
Yeah. And Henry Adams, of course, was he was a great friend of Theodore Roosevelt and who was the Secretary of State?
Hay, John Hay.
John Hay. And
But they also have Lodge and that whole
Yeah.
crowd.
Right. And they helped get it. They got us into the Spanish-American War.
Right. So he didn't like that. I mean, Henry Adams was not in favor of that.
Yeah.
But Roosevelt got us in. It's like a miracle the way that happened. You know, like Roosevelt's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy's playing golf, and while he's playing golf, Roosevelt starts a war in the Philippines. It's like, you know, he does it all himself.
Yeah,
it's
right.
Unbelievable.
Proceed immediately.
Right, right.
To Manila Bay.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah. So he was and of course he wrote that book, The Education of Henry Adams. So that generation, and Henry Adams' brother, Charles Francis Adams Jr., I think was president of the Union Pacific Railroad, was he not?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where it ended.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's 4 generations.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah, not
That's
bad.
pretty good. We were talking at lunch. There's about all these people that claim to be descendants of Adams, but none of them
Yeah.
seems to be. There's a man who was a corporate president that probably is a direct descendant, but it petered out.
Yeah.
It petered out, and Henry Adams never held office, never ran for office.
Yes, right.
And the education of Henry Adams is about failure. It's about being displaced by time and history. You know, it's an eloquent, ironic, tragic story about his life. And you know, he marries this woman who commits suicide, and she's buried in Rock Creek Park.
Right, big statue.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, Gore Vidal purchased the plot right next to that for himself.
He's not there yet.
No, he's not.
I wonder about something. You say it's tragic and about failure. And you point out in the book that John and John Quincy had a tragic, one could say flaw, or one could say a wonderful characteristic which almost nobody else has, which has been summed up by somebody or other in the phrase, "I'd rather be right than president."
Right. There was been a play about Franklin Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. George M. Cohan played him. But John Adams and John Quincy will be the same type of president, too. But remember, he's the guy, John, who defended the British troops
Yes.
in the Boston Massacre in 1770. This is the first clear evidence of the kind of contrarian streak in him. And Adams almost takes it to the point of perversity. He thinks most majorities are usually wrong.
And they are.
And they are. And the popular mood swings are usually excessive and misguided. Therefore, if you do something that's unpopular, it's probably the right thing to do.
Right.
And thus defending the British troops, or his big decision, his trademark decision as president was to avoid war with France, and which was very much almost going. It's called the quasi-war, and to negotiate an end to that, a peace treaty with France that avoided war. Very unpopular. I like to say, and you'll like this, Larry, that Adams is the anti-Bush. Bush got elected for a second term by going to an unnecessary war.
Yeah.
Adams assured that he would be defeated by not having an unnecessary war.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
He always said it's the proudest jewel in my crown if they wish to call me a monarchist.
And he thought, as you say, that if we went to war with either France or England, it was the end of the American experiment.
That he did. Washington thought the same thing. I mean, you had to avoid war until this new kind of political experiment settled, that it would break up into a series of confederacies, and England and or France would come in a predator fashion and take over the rest of the country outside the Alleghenies, and all kinds of scenarios. But that the phrase, "we the people of the United States," the first words of the Constitution, was an expression of a hope rather than a reality at that stage.
Right.
There were people did not identify with the nation. They
Right.
identify with their region, or at most their state or
Right.
their town. And it needed time, and I think that sometime after the War of 1812, you can begin to say there is some kind of national existence. But if you'd had a war before then, we would have split up.
Right. I think it was Shelby Foote who said, there was somebody who said, that before the Civil War, the phrase was the United States are, and after the United States is.
Yeah, he did. That was Shelby too.
Yeah, and it took that long.
Yeah.
For the spirit of one country, unity, nationalism, call it what you will, to build up.
Yeah, and a war for
yeah.
632,000 casualties over the issue
right.
of whether or not you wish the central government to have power over the states.
Right.
Right.
Talk, if you would, Joe, tell us a little bit about the many things that John Quincy, or as we would say here, John Quincy Adams.
Yeah, JQA they called him, JQA.
Did from the time he went abroad with his father through his ambassadorships.
Yeah, he's got an incredible life, and I thought about trying to write a biography of him, but I'll die before I ever finish it because the documentation is larger than for almost any figure in American history, because he kept a diary from the time he was 8 years old, and almost every day, and I mean every day, until he died at 81, he made an entry. Sometimes they were cryptic and just talked about the weather, but a lot of times, I was swimming in the nude in the Potomac today, and September the water is still fine, da da da. He did swim nude in the Potomac too. He used to also take walks between what is the White House and the Capitol and see how fast he could do it. He's a precocious child, reading Latin at 5. Groomed by his father and mother, very tough taskmasters. I don't want to judge them too harshly, but when he goes, John Quincy with his father over, and there's difficulties on the voyage, and she's worried about the ship going down because reports are that the seas are tough out there. And then finally she finds out they made it okay. But she says that to the extent that you grow up to be something other than a virtuous young man, I would prefer that you have died and gone into the ocean right now. It's like, whoa,
yeah.
And you've been handed many opportunities. If you do not take full advantage of them, it will be your fault. So he got all that pressure on him. He accompanies his father to Paris, and then the second time as well.
He learned French much better than his father did.
He learned French quickly, and he would take his father to plays and would translate for him. Very good with languages. And young people in general can pick them up faster than us old guys anyway. There one little anecdote, he got to know later, of course, Jefferson. He got to know John Quincy and became kind of this mentor when he was a young kid. And when he was president, he had John Quincy for dinner, and the president was talking about how he'd learned Spanish by reading Don Quixote on board the ship going over, and John Quincy said, "Mr. Jefferson tells lovely but tall stories." Jefferson never learned Spanish, and Jefferson never even learned French to be fluent in it, and in his correspondence he had to have somebody else do it for him. Anyway, John Quincy goes on to Harvard, doesn't do very well as a young lawyer, is immediately recognized by Washington as an up-and-coming guy.
May I stop you for just 1 second?
Yeah.
I was thunderstruck by the fact that the old man had to bail him out because he could not make a living as a lawyer.
Right.
How could that have happened?
He was living in a market that was saturated with lawyers.
Oh.
Yeah. Never heard of that one before, huh?
Never heard of that.
And he wasn't a salesman. He had difficulty selling himself.
Yes.
Okay. Whereas Charlie, as a lawyer in New York, and he's being mentored by Alexander Hamilton and his firm, he has all kinds of clients. But John Quincy not. John Quincy's emotionally immature too, and he's like, he doesn't know how to behave around people sometimes. And anyway, goes through that. At the age of, I think, 26, he is nominated to become American ambassador to the Netherlands. And And Adams is concerned about this because the vote for approval is in the Senate, and he's vice president who is overseeing the Senate. And there would be charges of nepotism here. Washington said it's not because he's the son of John Adams, he's the most qualified guy. One guy gets up in the debate in the Senate and says, is there anybody else fluent in Latin, Greek, French, Dutch, and Russian? Hearing none, so he was approved by acclamation.
Yeah.
He goes on to other posts in Prussia and in St. Petersburg. He marries a delicate orchid of a woman who's half English called Louisa. Louisa is with him the rest of his life. She has like 11 or 12 pregnancies and like 8 or 9 miscarriages.
Yeah.
He becomes a U.S. senator. He becomes a professor of rhetoric at Harvard. He becomes then eventually, after his ambassadorship to St. Petersburg, the Secretary of State under Monroe, probably the greatest Secretary of State in American history. He's responsible for what's called the Transcontinental Treaty, where we get Florida, and then this jagged line, everything west of the north and west of the Rockies and north of what is now California. So instead of calling it the Monroe Doctrine, they should call it the Adams Doctrine. Adams is responsible for that, even though Monroe as president gets it named after him. But the relationship with Britain and with the notion that this hemisphere should not be open to European colonization.
Was it he who said something to the effect that America goes not abroad in search of dragons to slay?
Exactly right. American goes not abroad in search of dragons to, it's not slay, but something like that. That's a phrase that George Kennan always used to like to use.
Yeah.
And it's from a speech that John Quincy gave in 1821 on the 4th of July. He was asked to give the 4th of July speech. It's a great speech. It ought to be rescued from its semi-oblivion, especially at this moment in our history. We were trying to think about what our foreign entanglements ought to be. But John Quincy thought that the best way to project America's values abroad was by example. And once you militarize that process, you fundamentally changed it.
Yeah, which has, as you're indicating, proven to be correct. In any event, he was one of the outstanding men of American history. That's beyond doubt.
He is the missing link between the founding generation and the Revolution and Lincoln. Like, as a little kid, his mother takes him by the hand, I think he's 7, to watch from afar the Battle of Bunker Hill. Sees his own doctor get killed, Joseph Warren. The end of his life, as he's giving a speech in the House of Representatives, he has a stroke, and he falls. And one of the people that gathers around him and helps carry his body out is Abraham Lincoln. The only term Lincoln served in the House. And so he's the missing link in American history.
That was, if I remember correctly, Joe, that was either the congressional term 46, 7, and 8, or 48, 9, and 50. Now,
it's in 48.
48.
Mm-hmm.
I have never heard or seen of a daguerreotype of John Quincy Adams.
There is one.
There is none.
Yes, there is. Yes, there are. There's a couple of them.
There are.
Uh-huh.
Now, there's a real link with the founding generation.
Yeah, it is. And there's a couple of them. He really looks like the meanest son who gets bitch you ever want to see. And Emerson says that he used arsenic in his tea. And he says he's like one of those cardinals, that totters on his cane. And then when he's named Pope, he throws the canes away and comes sprinting out of the building.
Yeah.
Henry Adams in The Education tells a great story when he's misbehaving as a young child and won't go to school. John Quincy just shows up at the door, doesn't say a thing, takes him by the hand and walks him to school, And his last years are really his greatest because he's a major advocate for ending slavery or for denying the right of slavery to expand. He's opposed to the Mexican War for that very reason, defends the captured Africans in the Amistad case, and opposes and successfully overturns the gag rule, which makes it illegal to talk about slavery in the House. So that's, in some sense, he's much better as a congressman than he is as president of the United States.
Yeah. To go back for a moment to the question of the drive for fame, how would you compare? I mean, American presidents are, you can say famous, you can say infamous, you can say notorious. There's a lot of words that could be used in their drive for fame. And I wonder if you might just, even if fleetingly, compare John Adams' drive for fame with certain other people, notably Lincoln, who had the same thing. And then, you know, you get the FDR and Clinton and, you know, so on and so forth.
There's more direct evidence in Adams's case that he was self-conscious about the fact that public service was the only form of achievement that would permit permit fame and posterity. That you could have a fortune or you could have fame, but you usually wouldn't get both. And fame was, in some sense, the higher form of currency as far as he's concerned. I think as the political process in 20th century America, at the national level especially, has become more expensive, more exhaustive, more media-driven, and that's certainly, I think, become true over the last 50 years. None of the people in the 18th century would have run for office in those conditions. They would regard anybody who does that as crazy. And in some sense, they are.
Yeah.
And I mean, you got to be crazy to do this.
Yeah.
And so we've created a political culture in which only a certain kind of mentality is going to succeed. And it's not quite their kind of mentality at all. And the level of desperation about winning at all costs, no matter how many times you have to reverse your position, and how much money you have to spend, and what the toll it takes on your family, that's not quite the same goal that Adams had. Okay, it's a bit irrational, and it seems to me it's not as attractive.
You're being kind. A couple of weeks ago, I read, finally, at long last, somebody wrote something that I've been saying for maybe 30 years. The fact that you're elected is proof positive that you shouldn't be.
Right. There's some truth. I mean, Adams felt that it's almost the Groucho Marx line. You know, any club that wants me, I don't want to belong to. It's so that's so political parties was something he didn't want to join at all. But I think in some sense, one of the reasons that there is this very real popular interest these days in the founders, and not just the Tea Party angle on it, which is somewhat misguided, I feel.
That's all political.
Yeah, but the fact that these people are buying books about Jefferson and Washington, and McCulloch's miniseries and that kind of thing, we see in them the sort of gold standard for the currently debased political currency of our time.
Yep.
And what's really different is they were interested in serving in the interest of the public, which is not the same thing as the interest of the people.
Right.
The interest of the people is a more fleeting and temporary thing, now driven by money.
Right.
The public is the long-term interest of the people, which at any given time, the majority of the people might not understand.
Right.
Do the right thing for the long-term interest of the people, regardless of its political consequences. And that's what is so attractive to people now, because they know nobody does that now.
You know, and I think you and I both realize that's very elitist, and if so, so be it.
That's right. It's pre-democratic.
Yeah.
And
so be it.
Well, that's the reason it worked.
Yeah.
And elitist is not a bad word. It's like, actually, when it was a bad word then was democracy.
Right.
Democracy was an epithet.
Right.
Democracy meant mob rule.
Right.
Democracy meant conceding the issue to people who don't understand it.
Right.
And so and what this is a natural aristocracy that we create then. It's what we would call a meritocracy.
Right.
None of them would have made it into the British aristocracy.
Right.
Hamilton was a bastard, literally. Jefferson, would have been a minor country farmer. Washington would have made major.
Yeah, Washington was, as I remember from your books, very angry that he could not.
Yeah, they wouldn't accept his appeal for a commission in the British Army.
Yeah, right.
And boy, did they regret that.
I have heard the bullets whizzing around me, and believe me, there is something charming
in the South. That's exactly right. It's after the Battle on the Monongahela where he survives miraculously.
Yeah.
But my point earlier is that simply that I think that generation embodied a form of political behavior that it's like a lost generation. You're never going to see it again.
Right.
And yet, its very existence is alluring, because once upon a time, there was a possible kind of political leadership that functioned in this fashion.
Right. Was it you who said it was somebody says the greatest leadership since some period of Rome?
Yeah, somebody was I think it was it's quoted in Perry Miller. It was a British leader was heard to say that this was the leadership in the United States under the founding was the greatest active political leadership in world history, with the possible exception of Rome under Caesar Augustus. That's what he said.
Not bad.
Not bad.
John Adams was the first to understand, apparently, that British interests, the first to understand what Britain really was trying to accomplish. And he was subsequently the first to understand the real differences between what the French wanted and what the United Colonies or United States wanted. Now, how is it that in a bodies full of people who are regarded as brilliant, he was the first, and for I guess for a long time the only one, to understand what was in the minds of the opponents and what they wanted to do?
The first example you're talking about is in the pre-revolutionary period. He's the first person to realize that this the tightening of the empire that begins in 1765 or so is going to lead to a secession from the British Empire. And that we've created two different cultures in America, and especially New England and England, and we can't stay together. And then he reads this as a conspiracy on the part of the Brits to impose these new constraints and to move us from being fellow members in the British Empire to colonists whose rights don't really exist. And he's very well read. One of the reasons he's very well read in English law and constitutional history. He's well read in European history. He's thought a lot about these constitutional issues, and as I indicated earlier, he's looking for it. He's looking for a cause that will eventually call the independence to latch himself to and become the leader of. So he's self-conscious about posing for these roles, so he wants to be appointed to the Continental Congress, and even though that's risky at that time. But he's betting the farm, okay? He's betting the farm his whole career, his life and fortune and sacred honor, as Jefferson put it, that this is going to be a revolution that's going to succeed. Even though we're going to be fighting the greatest military force, combined Army and Navy in the world, they don't have a chance. And we didn't fully, I think, understand why he was right about that until Vietnam. That Vietnam made us aware the British never had a chance. And it's a reverse. And he understood that, okay? And he was the equivalent of Secretary of Defense during the war up to 1778 in the Continental Congress, as head of the Board of War and Ordnance.
Did he understand about the so-called Fabian strategy?
Yes, he read about that. He said, no person has read more military history in the last 3 years in the world than I have. And he associated it sometimes with Fabius, but also with the Thebans in the Peloponnesian War. The Thebans essentially decided not to fight and to back off and never have a serious engagement with the Spartans or the Athenians, I guess it was. And after Washington nearly lost the army in Manhattan, he said, the Theban strategy is right for you now, meaning don't fight.
Yeah.
Or don't ever put the army in a situation where it can be annihilated.
Right, right.
So if, like people sometimes, they say Joseph Ellis is a presidential historian. I'm not a presidential historian. I write about people who happen to be president. But in his case, Adams's case, and this would be true of Washington and Jefferson as well, the presidency was not the capstone of their career. Adams thought the greatest thing he ever did, he did in the Continental Congress in the 1770s. That was his big moment, big contribution. Washington would have said it's winning the war. The presidency is a epilogue.
Let me go back in just one moment to the Continental Congress, because that's a major thing. But you've explained why he understood that that we were going to break with England, and England couldn't win. How did he come to understand that the French view of what they wanted in America was way different from the
time he first went to France, and he went once in '78, then came back to write the Massachusetts Constitution, which is not in the film, by the way. And then he goes back again. He's at odds with Franklin in terms of the delegation's posture towards the French government as embodied in the French Foreign Minister Vergennes. And Vergennes hates Adams. He thinks he's a bull in a china shop, which to some extent he is. So he's always saying that, for example, if the French come over to sign the Franco-American Treaty is signed in 1778, committing the French to the American cause. That means a lot of money, but it also means troops. He has it in the treaty, insists on it, that the French have to leave as soon as the war is over. And if they don't, something like war will start out because he's terrified that the French want to recover a portion of their North American empire.
Right.
Don't let them into Canada. Once they get up there, baby, they're never leaving.
Yeah.
Okay? And the French have a military agenda, a diplomatic agenda that's much larger than the United States. And the end of the war with England allows them to get back some of their colonies in the West Indies, so that there's a real tangle of European interests there that Adams wants to keep the United States clear of. And he is right to do that, and Franklin resists it. And Franklin is one of the wisest men of the age, to be sure, but he has been in France so long, and he is so close to Vergennes, he can't quite see it clearly. Eventually, Jay and Adams persuade him. And then he says, he's the one that breaks the word to Vergennes, by the way, we're going to sell you out. And in so doing, would you give us another 50 million livres? Here's the gall to be asking for money in this. Quite a character. But Adams sees big things that have huge strategic implications and consequences really clearly. He has a feeling of the future in his bones.
Well, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure coming here again. I enjoyed the questions. They'd allowed us to free associate in the way we can do that. And your program is one of the best on television, in my view, in terms of being informed about what the author has written and then allowing the conversation to follow its natural course. So, Larry, thank you so much.
Thank you. And since you've told us a little bit about your next book, I demand that you come here to be interviewed shortly after its publication.
It will be on the calendar, I promise you.
Okay, thank you. And to the audience, thank you for being with us, and be with us again next time.